Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to explore some really complex global dynamics, and our conversation is really anchored in a summary of a very rigorous, very thought-provoking academic article. The piece we're looking at is called When Great Powers Struggle: How Geopolitical Alignments of Small States Are Influenced by Their MNEs. And it's published in the Journal of Management Studies, which, is a top-tier FT50 listed journal. That tells you something about its quality and impact right there. The authors are Saara Matala from Chalmers University of Technology and Christian Stutz from the University of Jyväskylä. Brilliant work. And reading something like this, reading it deeply, it really affirms that, wisdom, empathy, human understanding, they aren't things you just optimize like code. They're lived. You gain them through, careful observation and thought. So whether or not you subscribe to this channel, we honestly encourage you to make time to read this article. It's thoughtfully crafted, it's rigorous, and it's open access. The link's right there in the show notes. Seriously, check it out. Our goal today is really to unpack this important paper, make its insights accessible, make them valuable, especially if you're maybe new to academic research or perhaps just starting out on your own research path. We want to show what makes this kind of scholarly work so vital, how you might approach it, and, what surprising things it can teach us. So we're setting the stage to look at how big shifts in global power, especially when great powers struggle or collapse, how that really hits smaller nations and their big international companies, their MNEs. We'll use some fascinating history from Finland to see how this plays out.
Yeah, you've set that up perfectly. I'm really excited to get into this. What's so fascinating, I think, is how this paper takes something huge and abstract, like geopolitics, stuff that feels like it only happens between presidents and diplomats. And it brings it right down to the level of actual companies making real strategic choices. It's about how these businesses don't just react to massive global forces. Sometimes they actually try to shape them.
Yeah, at its heart, the paper tackles this core tension. How do smaller nations, the ones with less clout and their MNEs, how do they actually navigate a world where the big powers are, struggling, losing influence, maybe even falling apart? And this paper gives us a really powerful framework for understanding that. It draws on some key theories like hegemonic stability theory and new institutional economics. Now, those might sound a bit academic, maybe a bit jargony.
A little bit, yeah. But honestly, think of them less as buzzwords and more as really useful analytical tools. They're frameworks that help us understand how these real-world challenges actually work and how different players, from countries down to firms, respond. This paper shows their value really clearly, I think. Makes complex stuff easier to grab onto.
Okay, let's unpack that first big idea then. Deglobalization. We hear that word thrown around a lot these days, right? But what does it actually mean here in this context? And why is it so critical for businesses and, for all of us, really? The paper defines it, citing WIT as the process of weakening interdependence among nations. So it's not just a slowdown, it's an active unraveling, is that right? Like the connections getting weaker.
Exactly. It's not just a dip in trade stats. It's the underlying ties, economic, political, maybe even cultural, starting to fray, actively weakening.
Got it. And how does that connect to this hegemonic stability theory you mentioned? That sounds important.
It really is. So that theory basically suggests that, widespread global integration, the kind that allows for relatively free trade, open investment, stable rules of the game, that often needs a dominant power, a hegemon, to sort of underwrite it. Think of it like a leading nation providing global public goods, security, stable economic rules. It kind of imposes a structure that, ideally benefits most players, even smaller ones. The U.S. after World War II is often seen that way.
Okay, like providing the stable foundation.
Precisely. But here's the crucial part for deglobalization. When that hegemon starts to lose influence, maybe its power wanes or serious challengers pop up, the whole system gets unstable. And that instability, as the paper points out, is what fuels deglobalization. It messes with the economic and political intentions that businesses rely on for cross-border stuff. Uncertainty goes up, costs go up.
Right. So what does that mean on the ground for these MNEs, these multinational companies? You'd think they'd pull back, right? De-internationalize.
Well, that's the obvious assumption. Deglobalization often means de-internationalization companies reducing their global footprint, focusing domestically, cutting risk.
Makes sense.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, the literature also points to this kind of paradox. Sometimes, in response to that very instability, MNEs might actually increase their international activity.
Really? How does that work?
Well, maybe by diversifying their supply chains more aggressively, so they're not reliant on one unstable region. Or maybe relocating investments to places they see as more stable, or having new growth potential. So it's not pulling back, it's more like reshuffling the deck, adapting to the chaos by spreading out even more, maybe finding new anchors. It's a counterintuitive response, but it happens. It's a key tension the paper explores.
Huh. Okay, spreading risk rather than retreating. That's a different way to think about it.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the paper really stresses something often glossed over: the huge power imbalances in global politics. We talk about countries trading, but it's not a level playing field, is it?
Not at all.
The paper calls this the small state perspective. Unlike great powers that can shape the whole system, set trade rules, project military power, most states are small in this power sense. They're just more vulnerable. They face economic pressure, security threats, so they often rely on what the paper terms protective shelters, maybe a strong alliance with a big power, or multilateral groups like the UN or NATO. Things that offer some stability they can't create alone.
So their options are more limited. They're reacting more than shaping.
Exactly. Their strategic choices are much more constrained. They're often playing defense or trying to find small advantages within a system they don't control. And this leads to the core question the paper asks. How much do the MNEs from these small states actually step in? Do they try to influence the diplomatic game to get better outcomes for themselves? Or are they just passengers?
Ah, okay. So can these companies actually nudge their country's foreign policy?
That's the question. And the paper suggests two main paths for small states when the big power dynamics shift. Either they try to defend their existing ties, stick with the struggling hegemon.
Hold on to what they know.
Right. Or they take a risk and explore new alignments, maybe pivot towards rising powers or new markets, and understanding which path they take and how MNEs influence that choice. Well, that's where the case studies come in.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. This idea of corporate diplomatic activities, CDAs. We usually think diplomacy is, governments and embassies.
Suits and flags, yeah.
Exactly. But this paper says companies are much more involved.
That's the argument. The paper defines CDA as basically political activities where MNEs use their resources, their money, connections, expertise to influence the diplomatic relationship between their home country and other countries.
And the goal is?
Their own strategic goals, usually. Market access, stable supply chains, favorable regulations, political stability for their investments, the usual business drivers.
But how is this different from just lobbying or what they call corporate diplomacy?
Good question. It's distinct. It's not just corporate diplomacy in the sense of managers having good cross-cultural skills, and it's more than international business diplomacy, which is usually about influencing one specific host government on a particular issue. CDA, as framed here, positions these MNEs as almost international actors in their own right, like states or big NGOs. They're seen as capable of actually influencing the international balance of power.
Wow. So not just lobbying for a tax break, but potentially shifting which countries their home nation aligns with.
Exactly. It suggests MNEs can literally influence a country's geopolitical leanings. That's a pretty big claim, and it changes how we might think about who really shapes foreign policy, especially behind the scenes.
Yeah, that really does challenge the standard view.
It absolutely does. Because traditionally, a lot of the international business thinking sees foreign relations as just context, external forces that companies react to. The standard line, as the paper quotes, is often that MNEs are influenced by diplomacy, but they have no explicit influence on it. They're seen as being on the receiving end, basically.
Right, just adapting to whatever the governments decide.
But this paper flips that. It argues MNEs, through these CDAs, can actively shape their home country's geopolitical stance. They're not just reacting, they're part of creating the environment, especially in smaller states where a few big companies can have a lot of weight.
So businesses become political actors too.
In a way, yes. Even if their motives are commercial, their actions can have profound political consequences. And what makes it tricky to study, as Burmester pointed out, is how much of this is hidden. It happens through informal chats, personal connections, quiet lobbying, not always public declarations. Burmester said, the silence speaks volumes.
So you have to dig deep to see it.
You really do. And to help us structure this, the study identifies two main types, or logics, of CDA. These really help make sense of the finished cases.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's defensive CDA. This is all about trying to maintain the country's existing ties with a great power that's struggling. The focus is on preserving the familiar stuff, the trade deals, the payment systems, the diplomatic routines.
Even if those systems are getting creaky.
Exactly. Even if they're inefficient or causing problems, it's about continuity, sticking with the devil you know, because the alternative seems too risky or uncertain.
Right.
Like patching up the old house instead of moving.
Okay, defensive holding the line. What's the other one?
The other is explorative CDA. This is the opposite, really. It's about actively trying to shape an alternative geopolitical alignment. It means helping the country shift away from the struggling power and towards new partners, new markets.
So looking for new opportunities, building new bridges.
Precisely. It means seeking out and creating entirely new institutional links, not just propping up the old ones. It's about forging a new path. You look at Table 2 in the paper, it shows this clearly. One strategy reinforces the status quo, the other accelerates the shift away from it. These two logics are key to understanding the different Finnish experiences.
Got it. Defensive versus explorative. Okay, let's dive into that first case study then. Finland's paper industry, 1914 to 1923. You said this was right when the first global economy was collapsing. Sounds like a chaotic time.
Extremely chaotic. So, context first. Before this, Finland was a grand duchy within the Russian Empire. Autonomous in some ways, but still part of that larger entity. Russia itself was a major power, but in a world with multiple big players, Britain, France, Germany.
A multipolar world.
Right. Then 1914 hits World War I. This just shattered the old order, the so-called first golden age of globalization that had been largely underpinned by British power, Pax Britannica.
Yeah.
That was over. And the U.S. wasn't quite ready to step in yet. A real power vacuum.
And Russia was in turmoil internally too, wasn't it?
Massive turmoil. Military defeats, growing unrest, culminating in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. That didn't just overthrow the Tsar, it led to a brutal civil war. And when the Bolsheviks won, they created Soviet Russia with a command economy totally different from the West. This really set up a separate economic bloc for decades, what the paper calls red deglobalization.
And amidst all that, Finland declares independence.
Exactly. December 1917. Some historians call it a historical accident, kind of catching the business world off guard. It was partly a reaction to earlier Russian attempts to clamp down on Finnish autonomy.
But independence wasn't smooth sailing either.
Not at all. Finland had its own brief, bloody civil war in early 1918. The anti-Bolshevik White forces won, helped by Germany. By 1919, Western powers recognized Finland, but the relationship with Soviet Russia remained tense. There was always this fear being pulled back into Russia's orbit.
Wow, okay, so massive political change. How did that hit the actual business, the paper exports?
It completely upended the economic institutions they relied on. Before the war, Finland had customs autonomy within the Russian Empire, so lower tariffs sending paper to Russia than elsewhere. Sounds good, but meant they didn't have their own independent trade policy. Beyond Russia, they had to manage in the free-ish global market, building their own networks in Western Europe. They were already quite self-reliant in that sense.
But WWI changed everything.
Dramatically. First, trade with enemies like Germany stopped. Then German U-boats blocked routes to Britain, a huge market. So suddenly Russia went from maybe a third of their paper exports to 95% by 1916-17.
95%. That's incredible dependence.
Hugely risky. And then came stage 2, 1917, the revolution. Chaos. Finnish paper companies had to get out of Russia, lost property, facilities, and the Bolsheviks introduced war communism, state monopoly on foreign trade. No more private deals.
So the main customer just disappeared and changed the rules entirely.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Even when things settled a bit in the 1920s, trading with the Soviets needed permission from Finland's new government ministry.
Yeah.
And crucially, talks for a proper trade agreement stalled. They didn't happen before 1939. This suggests a deliberate choice not to fully re-engage.
Which brings us back to that question. Why didn't they try harder to reconnect with Russia? There must have been pressure to restore that huge market.
You'd think so. But the paper argues this sharp break, this discontinuity, was driven by a new national elite forged in Finland's own civil war. Key figures in the paper industry, like Gustus Erlachius and Rudolf Walden, were veterans of the anti-Bolshevik White forces. They were deeply hostile to the Soviets, who had backed the other side in Finland's war. This anti-socialist view was really strong.
So ideology played a big role.
A huge role. And second, these guys saw themselves as nation builders. They'd lived through Russification attempts under the Tsar. Walden, for example, had actually resigned from the Russian military back in 1902 to protest those policies. They were fiercely protective of Finland's new independence.
Right. Their business was tied up with national survival.
Absolutely. And third, there was this powerful Western orientation among this new elite. It was an informal institution, a shared belief. They had often studied or worked abroad, Sirlachius in Austria and Britain. They saw Finland's future with the West, not Russia. There's a great quote from a 1918 FinPap meeting, that's the paper industry cartel, saying something like, "We need to show Finland isn't just a parasite on Russia. Time will show they need us." It's a declaration of independence, really.
Wow. So they were actively pushing back against anyone still looking towards Russia.
Yeah, the leadership was apparently frustrated with members still betting on Russian markets. This Western anti-Bolshevik mindset was deeply ingrained. It wasn't just about markets, it was about national identity.
Okay, so given that mindset, what did their corporate diplomatic activities, their CDAs, actually look like? You call them explorative.
Exactly. Explorative. They were actively trying to shape Finland's new place in the world, redirecting business away from Russia towards the West. It was proactive, almost a nation-building strategy through business.
How did they even do that? Finland was brand new, no embassies.
Right, that's key. These activities started in 1918. There was a global paper shortage, which actually helped create demand, but also rising protectionism everywhere, and Finland wasn't even recognized yet. So in this diplomatic vacuum, business leaders like Sirlachius and Walden basically became the diplomats. They led the industry cartel, FinPap, to present a united front, and they took charge of temporary government trade bodies that eventually became the official Ministry of Trade and Industry.
So the MNE leaders were the de facto foreign trade ministry.
In the early days, pretty much. They were Finland's first foreign trade policy elite, blending private sector needs with nascent state functions.
Where did they focus first?
Initially, Germany and German-occupied areas like Ukraine and the Baltics. This was early 1918. They thought Germany might dominate post-war Europe. They were trying to open alternative markets there, negotiating for Finland's interests. There's a quote where FinPap discusses trade talks with Ukraine, saying it's in the interest of both the paper industry and the public at large not to rush into a bad deal. They saw themselves representing the whole country.
But the German bet didn't last long.
No. After the German armistice in late 1918, the Allies took control of Finland's trade axis for a while. So the focus shifted decisively to the West Britain, the U.S., just as their underlying beliefs dictated. A FinPap meeting note from early 1919 says, Finnish paper exports seem to be going west in the future. They use their pre-independence experience and their new quasi-government roles. This Flying Trade Commission visited allied countries.
And it worked.
It did, remarkably well. Despite challenges, they re-established old ties and, with help from foreign agents, even broke into the U.S. and South American markets. Meanwhile, trade with Soviet Russia stayed tiny. It's a textbook case of turning deglobalization into an opportunity for expansion through really proactive, explorative CDAs.
That's an incredible story of adaptation. The leadership really seemed to drive that shift.
Absolutely. The clarity of their vision, anti-Soviet, pro-West nation building, combined with the power vacuum that let them step into diplomatic roles, was crucial.
Okay, let's switch gears dramatically. Fast forward to the 1980s. Red deglobalization, the Soviet bloc starting to unravel. You said this time we see a defensive strategy from Finnish MNEs.
A very different story, yes.
Yeah.
Defensive CDAs this time aimed at preserving the status quo, even as it was clearly crumbling.
So what was the context here? Finland in the 80s.
Okay, so post-WWII, Finland is a democratic market economy, but walking this tightrope between East and West, it had this special position, a very profitable trading relationship with the Soviet Union, especially for things like ships, highly formalized through bilateral agreements. But Finland was also integrating westward, joined EFTA, later applied to the EU after the Soviet collapse, so it had feet in both camps in a way.
And the Soviet Union itself was starting to fray.
Seriously fraying. There were geopolitical tensions, sure, Afghanistan, Reagan calling it the evil empire, but the bigger drivers were internal Soviet problems. The planned economy just wasn't working. Stagnation, unrest, separatist movements, the whole system was losing coherence. Then you had the Berlin Wall fall in '89, Eastern Europe breaks away.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union itself dissolved in December 1991. And the paper notes this largely caught Finland by surprise. They thought the system would last much longer.
Right. So given these clear signs of Soviet decline, why did Finnish shipbuilding MNEs try to hang on? Why not pivot like the paper guys did decades earlier? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it wasn't just about market logic. It was tied up with national strategy and this powerful informal institution. Let's look at the economic structures first. Finnish ship exports depended heavily on these specific 5-year bilateral deals with the Soviets, very centralized. But Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, ironically started messing this up. regional Soviet players bypassed central control, disrupting the internal Soviet trade that balanced the deals with Finland. The old system was breaking down from within.
And the payment system had issues too.
Big issues. This bilateral clearing trade, basically swapping goods for goods, worked okay when the Soviet economy was stable. But now, with the Soviet economic problems and falling oil prices, their main export, they couldn't send enough goods back to Finland to pay for the ships. Finland ended up with a massive trade surplus. By 1981, the Soviet deficit was huge. By 1986, they were only covering about 75% of Finnish exports with their own goods.
That's where the 600,000 ladas anecdote comes from. They literally weren't sending enough cars.
Exactly. It sounds funny, but it meant Finland had this huge pile of unusable Soviet IOUs.
Yeah.
President Koivisto even admitted privately by 87 that the clearing trade had become a liability. Finland was the only capitalist country stuck in this system. It was a burden.
So the economics were screaming, get out. Why didn't they listen?
This is where the informal institutions kick in. Unlike the paper case with its discontinuity, here we see the persistence of old beliefs. There was this deep-seated idea in the Finnish elite that keeping the Soviet trade going was vital for Finland's sovereignty, a real fear that upsetting Moscow could endanger the country. Western observers called it Finlandization.
Ah, yes, Finlandization. I've heard that term.
Walter Lacour described it back in '77 as this collective self-censorship. Leaders, media, citizens, everyone behaved responsibly regarding the Soviet Union to ensure national survival. You just didn't rank the boat, publicly at least. By the 80s, the shipbuilding industry was so tied to national security building vital Soviet ships that economic and political logic were inseparable for the elite. So Finland, this capitalist country, found itself trying to prop up the Soviet command economy trade system, even as the Soviets were trying to reform it.
Wow. So that Finlandization mindset really locked them in.
It seems so.
Yeah.
It created this powerful inertia, a resistance to change, because the perceived political risks of pivoting seemed greater than the mounting economic costs of staying put. It was seen as a national security imperative.
Okay, so if they were locked into this defensive posture, what did their CDAs look like? How did they try to preserve this crumbling relationship?
Their actions were all about maintaining that alignment and access. And it helped that the shipbuilding bosses were part of Finland's elite. They weren't just CEOs. They had deep personal ties to politicians, top civil servants. Wärtsilä's chairman, Tankmar Horn, was even a former diplomat. These guys were insiders. They sat on government committees dealing with Soviet trade. They could present a unified front.
So they used informal channels.
Heavily. That fishing trip anecdote from 1981 is a perfect example. The trade system was under stress, so Wärtsilä invites a key Bank of Finland official and the Soviet delegation for a relaxed weekend before formal talks. The Finn involved later said everyone was happy, the mood was great. Wärtsilä knew these things. Style. It wasn't just socializing, it smoothed the way for the Bank of Finland to keep covering the Soviet deficits, papering over the cracks. Informal diplomacy at its finest, or perhaps most desperate.
So personal connections and strategic fishing trips. What else?
They also actively pressured their own government to help the Soviets, because Soviet problems were hurting Finnish exports. Remember, Pseudo-Import, the Soviet trade body, literally told Wärtsilä to put the screws on the Finnish government to fix the trade issues.
The Soviets were telling Finnish companies to lobby the Finnish government.
Yes. And Finland did respond. In 1988, they came up with a compromise, limit the deficit, but also offer subsidized credits for exports like ships to the Soviets. Publicly, they called it a new beginning, but really it was doubling down on a failing model.
And they tried adapting to perestroika, too. Joint ventures.
They did. Initially, Finnish shipbuilders were wary of joint ventures, worried about profits, secrecy. But when the Soviets opened up to them, the Finns adjusted, seeing it as a way to maintain access. Wärtsilä's CEO even wrote directly to the Finnish foreign minister asking for support promoting joint ventures during a state visit. They were trying every angle to keep the relationship alive, adapting defensively.
But ultimately, it didn't work.
Ultimately, no. Despite all these defensive CDAs, the Soviet collapse just overwhelmed the system. De-internationalization happened anyway. Bankruptcies, mergers, and ship exports to Russia didn't restart properly until 2005, 14 years later. The defensive strategy bought time, maybe, but couldn't stop the tide.
Such a stark contrast to the paper industry case. One proactive and expanding, the other defensive and contracting.
Exactly. The Finlandization mindset, that deep-seated belief system, combined with the specific nature of the shipbuilding assets, really seem to trap them in that defensive loop. It shows how powerful those informal rules of the game can be.
So let's pull this together. We have these two really different outcomes. Paper MNEs thriving through deglobalization, shipbuilders getting hammered by it. What's the core explanation for this difference?
Well, recapping. Paper MNEs used the chaos of WWI and the Russian Revolution to break free and expand globally. Shipbuilding MNEs faced Soviet decline and ended up shrinking, restructuring. One internationalized, the other de-internationalized.
And the key difference lies in those informal institutions.
That's what the paper argues very convincingly. The informal rules, the shared beliefs, the elite networks. In the paper case, Finland's independence and civil war created a discontinuity. A new elite came in with strong anti-Soviet pro-Western views. This enabled explorative CDAs. They actively pushed away from Russia.
New beliefs allowed a new strategy.
Right, whereas in the shipbuilding case, there was persistence. The Finlandization ideology, the belief that Soviet trade ensured sovereignty, remained dominant among the elite even as the USSR declined. This locked them into defensive CDAs, trying to preserve the old ties.
And the nature of the business mattered too. Asset specificity.
Yes, that's an important supporting factor. Paper is a bulk commodity, easier to sell elsewhere. Those specialized icebreakers built for Soviet conditions, very hard to find other buyers for. That made pivoting much harder for the shipbuilders, reinforcing the defensive logic.
Okay, so thinking about this for someone maybe new to research, what are the big takeaways? How does this study change how we should think about international business?
I think it makes several really important contributions. First, it really sharpens our understanding of corporate diplomatic activities, CDA. It pushes back strongly against the idea that companies just react to diplomacy. It shows they can actively shape their home country's geopolitical direction. They're actors, not just reactors.
Even if it's hidden diplomacy.
Especially then. It shows these MNEs, particularly from small states, are quite capable of this, even if we don't always see it. It opens up new questions about how firms become political players. Second, it champions this small state perspective on geopolitics. A lot of IB research treats geopolitics as just, a risk factor between two countries. This paper says, no, you have to look at the bigger power structure. Small states have way less room to maneuver. Their M&E strategies aren't just about the firm. They're deeply constrained by their country's position in the global pecking order. We need to take power asymmetry much more seriously in IB research.
So context, the real power context, matters hugely.
Absolutely. And third, it helps revise how we tell the story of globalization and deglobalization. The standard narrative is often very Western-centric, Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, these neat waves. This study offers a revisionist account by bringing in the Pax Sovietica, the Soviet sphere's experience. It shows the Soviet Union created its own parallel economic system, a socialist counterbalance. Yeah. Globalization wasn't one uniform wave hitting everyone the same way.
So different parts of the world were experiencing globalization or deglobalization differently at the same time.
Precisely. The paper uses that great German phrase, Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, the non-simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. Different historical conditions existing side by side. What was globalization for the West might have been deglobalization for Finland relative to Russia, or vice versa. It forces a much more nuanced view. Historical research like this, looking at things from different angles, is vital for challenging assumptions and building better theories. It makes us see the world's complexity.
That non-simultaneity idea is really powerful. Okay, so wrapping this up, what should someone listening take away from all this? If you're navigating today's world or starting your own research, what are the lessons?
Well, I think this close look at Finland shows just how intertwined business strategy, national interest, and global power shifts really are. It's a complex dance. And it shows that even smaller players, like companies from small states, can influence big diplomatic outcomes, even within constraints. Their choices, defensive or explorative, really matter.
And the paper itself points to areas for more research, right? Like when company interests don't align with national interests.
Exactly. The paper acknowledges that limitation. What happens when MNE goals diverge from the home countries? How does that affect CDAs? It's a huge question today. And also, how do today's incredibly complex global value chains change things? Does that interdependence make relations more stable, or just create new vulnerabilities compared to the simpler bilateral trade in these cases? Lots to explore there.
And it ends with a really striking modern parallel, doesn't it, about Finnish shipbuilding and Russia today?
It does. A very poignant closing thought. It notes the Finnish shipyards disengaging from Russia again. Now, after the invasion of Ukraine. After nearly 150 years of building ships for Russia, that Russian era ends, and it asks, is this the end of shipbuilding or a new beginning? It forces you to think about how these historical patterns of alignment, disengagement, and realignment are playing out right now all around us. How are companies and countries navigating today's shifts?
It really brings the history right up to the present. A lot to think about. We hope this exploration has given you some new perspectives, maybe sparked some ideas for your own thinking or research. Thanks so much for joining us.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.
রিভাইজ অ্যান্ড রিসাবমিটে স্বাগতম। আমি প্যাভলভ।
আর আমি নিকিতা। নমস্কার। আজকের আলোচনাটা আমরা করছি জার্নাল অফ ম্যানেজমেন্ট স্টাডিজে প্রকাশিত একটা আর্টিকেলের সারসংক্ষেপ নিয়ে। এটা কিন্তু একটা দারুণ জার্নাল, মানে ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল টাইমস র্যাঙ্কিংয়ে প্রথম 50টার মধ্যে, FT50 যাকে বলে।
হ্যাঁ, খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ একটা জার্নাল।
আর্টিকেলটা লিখেছেন সারা মাতালা, উনি চার্লমার্স ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ টেকনোলজির, আর ক্রিশ্চিয়ান স্টুটস, ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ ইভাস্কুলার। সত্যি বলতে কি, এই ধরনের লেখা পড়লে বোঝা যায় যে প্রজ্ঞা বা মানবিক বোঝাপড়া এগুলো না মানে অপটিমাইজ করার জিনিস না, এগুলো আসলে জীবন দিয়ে শিখতে হয়।
ঠিক, অভিজ্ঞতার ব্যাপার।
আমরা সবাইকে অনুরোধ করব, চ্যানেল সাবস্ক্রাইব করুন বা নাই করুন, এই অসাধারণ ওপেন অ্যাক্সেস আর্টিকেলটা পড়ার জন্য একটু সময় বের করবেন প্লিজ। লিঙ্কটা শো নোটসে দেওয়া আছে।
একদম, বিশেষ করে যারা গবেষণার জগতে নতুন।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক তাই। আজকের আলোচনাটা মূলত তাদের কথা ভেবেই যারা হয়তো একাডেমিক গবেষণায় নতুন পা রাখছেন বা নিজের রিসার্চ জার্নি শুরু করতে চলেছেন। আমরা চেষ্টা করব একটা বেশ জটিল বিষয়, মানে কিভাবে ছোট দেশের মাল্টিন্যাশনাল কোম্পানিগুলো, মানে MNE-গুলো বিশ্ব রাজনীতির বা ক্ষমতার পালাবদলের সময় নিজেদের দেশের জিওপলিটিক্যাল অবস্থানকে প্রভাবিত করে, সেটা একটু সহজ করে বলতে।
আচ্ছা,
বিষয়টা বুঝতে এই গবেষণাটা ফিনল্যান্ডের দুটো আলাদা সময়ের ঘটনাকে দেখেছে। দুটোই ছিল বলতে পারেন ডিগ্লোবালাইজেশন পিরিয়ড, যখন বিশ্ব ব্যবস্থায় একটা ওলটপালট চলছিল। সেই সময় ফিনিশ কোম্পানিগুলো তাদের প্রতিবেশী মানে রাশিয়া, যেটা তখন দুর্বল হয়ে পড়ছিল, সেই পরাশক্তির সাথে দেশের সম্পর্ককে একরকম প্রভাবিত করার চেষ্টা করেছিল।
হ্যাঁ, এখানে ওই কর্পোরেট ডিপ্লোম্যাটিক অ্যাক্টিভিটিস বা CDA ধারণাটা আসছে।
CDA, এটা একটু বুঝিয়ে বলবেন?
নিজেদের সুবিধার জন্য, ধরুন ব্যবসার স্বার্থে, দেশের যে কূটনীতি বা ফরেন পলিসি সেটাকে প্রভাবিত করার চেষ্টা করে। তারা রাজনৈতিকভাবে সক্রিয় হয়ে ওঠে আর কি।
ও আচ্ছা, তার মানে কোম্পানিগুলো শুধু ব্যবসায়ী করে না, দরকার পড়লে দেশের হয়ে বা নিজেদের স্বার্থে ডিপ্লোমেসিতেও ঢুকে পড়ে।
একদম। আর এই রিসার্চে দুটো আলাদা CDA কৌশল দেখা গেছে। একটা হলো ডিফেন্সিভ, মানে রক্ষণাত্মক।
রক্ষণাত্মক?
হ্যাঁ, মানে ধরুন একটা পরাশক্তি দুর্বল হয়ে পড়ছে, কিন্তু তার সাথে দেশের যে পুরনো সম্পর্ক সেটাকেই টিকিয়ে রাখার চেষ্টা করা। যেমন ফিনল্যান্ডের জাহাজ তৈরির কোম্পানিগুলো করেছিল। তারা সোভিয়েত ইউনিয়নের সাথে সম্পর্কটা ধরে রাখতে চেয়েছিল, যদিও সোভিয়েত ইউনিয়ন তখন ক্ষয়িষ্ণু।
বুঝেছি। আর দ্বিতীয়টা?
দ্বিতীয়টা হলো এক্সপ্লোরেটিভ, মানে অনুসন্ধানমূলক। এখানে কোম্পানিগুলো চেষ্টা করে দেশকে পুরনো বলয় থেকে বের করে নতুন কোনো শক্তির দিকে বা নতুন বাজারের দিকে নিয়ে যেতে। যেমন ফিনিশ কাগজ কোম্পানিগুলো প্রথম বিশ্বযুদ্ধ আর রাশিয়ান বিপ্লবের পর তারা পশ্চিমের দেশগুলোর দিকে ঝুঁকেছিল, নতুন সংযোগ, নতুন বাজার খুঁজছিল।
আচ্ছা, কিন্তু ফলাফল তো নিশ্চয়ই একরকম হয়নি দুটো ক্ষেত্রে। এখানেই তো ব্যাপারটা ইন্টারেস্টিং, তাই না?
ঠিক, একদম ঠিক। ফলাফলে অনেক তফাৎ। কাগজ কোম্পানিগুলো কিন্তু বেশ সফল হয়েছিল, নতুন বাজার খুঁজে পেয়েছিল, আন্তর্জাতিকভাবে ছড়িয়ে পড়েছিল।
আর জাহাজ কোম্পানিগুলো?
তারা কিন্তু পারেনি। তারা ওই পুরনো সম্পর্ক রক্ষা করতে গিয়ে শেষ পর্যন্ত বাজারই হারিয়ে ফেলে। এটাকে বলে ইন্টারন্যাশনালাইজেশন, মানে আন্তর্জাতিক বাজার থেকে গুটিয়ে আসা।
কিন্তু কেন এই পার্থক্যটা হলো? মানে কারণটা কি ছিল? একই দেশ, একই সময়ের কাছাকাছি ঘটনা, অথচ এত ভিন্ন ফল।
হ্যাঁ, এর মূল কারণটা কিন্তু লুকিয়েছিল দেশের ভেতরের ব্যবস্থায়, মানে যাকে বলে অনানুষ্ঠানিক প্রতিষ্ঠান বা ইনফর্মাল ইনস্টিটিউশনস।
অনানুষ্ঠানিক প্রতিষ্ঠান মানে
হলো সমাজের গভীরে যে বিশ্বাসগুলো চালু থাকে, সামাজিক রীতিনীতি, বিভিন্ন মানুষের নেটওয়ার্ক, এগুলো কিন্তু লিখিত আইন বা নিয়মের মতো নয়, কিন্তু খুব শক্তিশালী।
আচ্ছা, কিভাবে এটা প্রভাব ফেলল?
দেখুন, কাগজ শিল্পের ক্ষেত্রে কি হয়েছিল। ফিনল্যান্ড যখন স্বাধীন হলো তখন একটা নতুন এলিট ক্লাস উঠে এলো। তারা বলশেভিক রাশিয়াকে খুব একটা ভরসা করত না, বরং পশ্চিমের সাথে সম্পর্ক তৈরিতে বেশি আগ্রহী ছিল। তাদের এই মানসিকতায় ওই এক্সপ্লোরেটিভ বা অনুসন্ধানমূলক কৌশলকে সমর্থন দিয়েছিল।
বুঝেছি, সমাজের ভেতরের হাওয়াটা পশ্চিমের দিকে ছিল।
অনেকটা তাই, কিন্তু জাহাজ শিল্পের ক্ষেত্রে ছবিটা ছিল অন্যরকম। সেখানে যারা এলিট ছিলেন, মানে টেকনোক্র্যাটরা, তাদের মধ্যে একটা গভীর বিশ্বাস ছিল যে হ্যাঁ, সোভিয়েত ইউনিয়ন হয়তো দুর্বল হচ্ছে, কিন্তু ফিনল্যান্ডের সার্বভৌমিত্বের জন্য তাদের সাথে দ্বিপাক্ষিক বাণিজ্যটা জরুরি।
তার মানে সোভিয়েত ইউনিয়ন দুর্বল হলেও সম্পর্ক রাখাটাকেই তারা দেশের জন্য ভালো মনে করেছিলেন।
ঠিক, এই বিশ্বাসটাই তাদের ডিফেন্সিভ বা রক্ষণাত্মক কৌশল নিতে বাধ্য করে বা প্রভাবিত করে, আর সেটাই শেষ পর্যন্ত তাদের জন্য ক্ষতিকর হলো।
তার মানে শুধু কোম্পানির স্ট্র্যাটেজি নয়, দেশের মানুষের ভাবনা চিন্তা, বিশ্বাস, নেটওয়ার্ক, এইগুলো জিওপলিটিক্সে বিশেষ করে ছোট দেশগুলোর জন্য একটা বড় ভূমিকা পালন করে, কারণ তাদের তো অপশন বলেই কম থাকে।
একদম, এটাই গবেষণার মূল কথাগুলোর একটা। মাল্টিন্যাশনাল কোম্পানিগুলো কিন্তু শুধু পরিস্থিতির শিকার হয় না, তারা নিজেরাও কর্পোরেট ডিপ্লোমেসির মাধ্যমে জিওপলিটিক্যাল সম্পর্ককে প্রভাবিত করার চেষ্টা করে।
কিন্তু তাদের সাফল্য নির্ভর করে,
হ্যাঁ, তাদের কৌশলটা মানে রক্ষণাত্মক হবে নাকি অনুসন্ধানমূলক, আর সেই কৌশলের সাফল্য দুটোই নির্ভর করে দেশের ভেতরের ওই অনানুষ্ঠানিক প্রতিষ্ঠানগুলোর উপর, আর অবশ্যই বাইরের বৃহত্তর জিওপলিটিক্যাল পরিস্থিতির উপর।
এই গবেষণাটা গ্লোবালাইজেশন বা ডিগ্লোবালাইজেশনকে শুধু ওয়েস্টার্ন বা বড় দেশগুলোর চোখ দিয়ে না দেখে ছোট দেশগুলোর দিক থেকেও বুঝতে সাহায্য করছে। যেমন এখানে প্যাক্স সোভিয়েতিকা বা সোভিয়েত প্রভাব বলার কথাটাও এসছে, যেটা সাধারণত আলোচনায় আসে না।
ঠিক, প্রায়শই আমরা বড় শক্তিগুলোর খেলাটাই দেখি, ছোটদের ভূমিকাটা এড়িয়ে যাই। সবশেষে একটা প্রশ্ন রেখে যাই, মানে ভাবনার জন্য আর কি। দেখুন, এখনও তো বিশ্বজুড়ে পাওয়ার স্ট্রাকচারে অনেক পরিবর্তন আসছে, তাই না?
হ্যাঁ, অবশ্যই।
তো এই সময়ে দাঁড়িয়ে ছোট দেশগুলোর যে বড় বড় কোম্পানিগুলো আছে, তাদের কাজকর্ম পর্দার আড়ালে কিভাবে ভবিষ্যতের জিওপলিটিক্যাল সম্পর্ককে তৈরি করছে, এমন কোনো ডিপ্লোম্যাটিক খেলা কি চলছে যা আমরা হয়তো টেরই পাচ্ছি না?
খুবই ইন্টারেস্টিং প্রশ্ন, সত্যি ভাবার মতো। আর দর্শকদের আবারও মনে করিয়ে দিই, যারা বিষয়টা নিয়ে আরও গভীরে জানতে চান, পুরো আর্টিকেলটার লিঙ্ক কিন্তু শো নোটসে দেওয়া আছে। বিশেষ করে যারা গবেষণা করছেন বা করতে চান, তাদের জন্য এটা খুব কাজের হতে পারে।
অবশ্যই পড়া উচিত।
नमस्कार।
नमस्कार। रिवाइज एंड रीसबमिट में आपका स्वागत है। मैं हूं पावलोव
और मैं हूं निकिता। आज हम बात कर रहे हैं जर्नल ऑफ मैनेजमेंट स्टडीज में छपे एक लेख के बारे में। ये जर्नल FT50 लिस्ट में है, यानी काफ़ी प्रतिष्ठित है, और इसके लेखक हैं सारा मत्ताला, चार्ल्स यूनिवर्सिटी से, और क्रिश्चियन स्टुत्स, यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ जाविस्किला से। सच कहूँ तो इसे पढ़कर लगता है कि ज्ञान और सहानुभूति, ये चीज़ें सिर्फ थ्योरी में नहीं होती, इन्हें जीना पड़ता है। हम तो यही कहेंगे कि अगर समय मिले तो इस लेख को ज़रूर पढ़िएगा। ये ओपन एक्सेस है और लिंक हमने शो नोट्स में डाल दिया है।
हाँ बिल्कुल, और ये बातचीत उन लोगों के लिए खासकर फायदेमंद हो सकती है जो अकादमिक रिसर्च में नए हैं, अपनी रिसर्च यात्रा भी शुरू ही कर रहे हैं। लिखा मूल सवाल बड़ा दिलचस्प है। जब दुनिया में बड़ी ताकतों के बीच मतलब शक्ति संतुलन बदल रहा हो, तो छोटे देशों की जो मल्टीनेशनल कंपनियां हैं, MNEs जिन्हें कहते हैं, वो अपने देश की जियोपॉलिटिकल लाइन, मतलब वो किस तरफ झुकेगा, इसे कैसे प्रभावित करती हैं।
अच्छा, तो चलिए इसे थोड़ा खोलते हैं, ये समझने की कोशिश करते हैं कि जब बड़ी शक्तियां लड़ रही हों या कमज़ोर हों, तो छोटे देशों की कंपनियां क्या करती हैं? क्या वो सिर्फ देखती रहती हैं?
नहीं, बिल्कुल नहीं, वो सक्रिय हो सकती हैं। लेख का फोकस ऐसे ही दौर पर है, भू राजनीतिक अस्थिरता, और जिसे वैश्वीकरण या डीग्लोबलाइजेशन कहते हैं। मतलब जब दुनिया का आपसी जुड़ाव कम होने लगता है। ऐसे में छोटे देश तो अक्सर बड़ी शक्तियों पर निर्भर होते हैं ना,
है ना,
और उनकी नीतियों से बहुत जल्दी प्रभावित भी होते हैं।
यहीं पर एक महत्वपूर्ण कॉन्सेप्ट आता है, कॉर्पोरेट डिप्लोमेटिक एक्टिविटीज, यानी CDA।
CDA
ये क्या है?
ये वो राजनीतिक गतिविधियां हैं जो MNEs अपने रणनीतिक फायदे के लिए करती हैं। मतलब वो कोशिश करती हैं कि उनके अपने देश और मेजबान देश जहां वो काम कर रही हैं उनके बीच के राजनयिक संबंध उनके हक में जाएं।
अच्छा, यानी कंपनियां सिर्फ बाजार में ही नहीं डिप्लोमेसी में भी दखल देती हैं। तो लेखकों ने इसे कैसे स्टडी किया, क्या तरीका अपनाया उन्होंने?
उन्होंने फिनलैंड की MNEs का एक तुलनात्मक ऐतिहासिक विश्लेषण किया है। दो अलग अलग दौर देखे जब रूस ने कह सकते हैं अस्थायी रूप से अपनी महाशक्ति वाली हैसियत खो दी थी।
कौन सा दौर था वो?
पहला था वर्ल्ड वॉर 1 के दौरान 1914 से 1923, फिनलैंड की कागज बनाने वाली कंपनियां। और दूसरा शीत युद्ध के अंत में 1981 से 1993, फिनलैंड की जहाज बनाने वाली कंपनियां।
और इसके लिए उन्होंने काफी गहराई से काम किया है ना?
हाँ बिल्कुल, 11,000 से ज्यादा पन्नों के ओरिजिनल आर्काइवल दस्तावेज देखे उन्होंने। ये वाकई बहुत गहन शोध है।
11,000 काफी ज्यादा है ये तो। और दिलचस्प बात ये है कि दोनों मामलों में हालात एक जैसे थे। मतलब रूस कमजोर हो रहा था, लेकिन कंपनियों ने एकदम अलग रास्ते चुने और नतीजे भी बिल्कुल अलग रहे।
हाँ, यही सबसे रोचक बात है। पहले मामले में यानी कागज MNEs WWY, इन्होंने एक खोजपूर्ण या एक्सप्लोरेटरी सीडिया रणनीति अपनाई।
खोजपूर्ण मतलब
उन्होंने सक्रिय रूप से फिनलैंड को ढहते ज़ारेस्ट रूस से दूर पश्चिमी ताकतों की तरफ मोड़ने में मदद की। और नतीजा, सब तरफ संरक्षणवाद बढ़ रहा था, लेकिन फिर भी उन्होंने इंटरनेशनल बिजनेस के नए रास्ते खोल लिए।
कमाल है। ऐसा क्यों हुआ?
वजह थी फिनलैंड के अनौपचारिक संस्थानों में बदलाव। मतलब वहां की सोच, मान्यताएं, नेटवर्क। आजादी के बाद एक नया एलीट वर्ग सामने आया जो बोल्शेविक रूस के खिलाफ था और पश्चिम की तरफ देख रहा था। इस माहौल ने कंपनियों को नई दिशा तलाशने में मदद की।
अच्छा, और दूसरे मामले में क्या हुआ? जहाज बनाने वाली कंपनियां, शीत युद्ध का अंत, इन्होंने क्या किया?
इन्होंने ठीक उल्टा किया। एक रक्षात्मक या डिफेंसिव सीडिया रणनीति अपनाई। सोवियत संघ बिखर रहा था, लेकिन ये कंपनियां फिनलैंड के पुराने जो विशेष संबंध थे सोवियत संघ से, उन्हें बचाने में लगी रहीं।
और इसके नतीजा क्या हुआ?
नतीजा ये हुआ कि सोवियत संघ के पतन के बाद उनका अंतर्राष्ट्रीय व्यापार काफी घट गया, जिसे वे अंतर्राष्ट्रीयकरण या डी इंटरनेशनलाइजेशन कहते हैं।
लेकिन इस बार ऐसा क्यों हुआ? माहौल तो यहाँ भी बदल रहा था।
यहाँ वजह थी अनौपचारिक संस्थानों की निरंतरता। मतलब सोच बदली नहीं थी। उस वक्त का जो स्थापित टेक्नोक्रेटिक एलीट था, वो मानता था कि सोवियत संघ से व्यापार फिनलैंड की आजादी के लिए जरूरी है। वो फिनलैंडाइजेशन का दौर था। इसी सोच ने कंपनियों को पुराने रास्ते पर ही बनाए रखा।
तो ये तो बहुत दिलचस्प है कि कंपनियों की रणनीति सिर्फ बाजार या आर्थिक हालात पर नहीं, बल्कि देश के अंदर की सोच और सत्ता समीकरणों पर भी कितनी निर्भर करती है।
हाँ बिल्कुल। और इन अलग अलग नतीजों को समझाने के लिए लेखकों ने दो मुख्य थ्योरीज का इस्तेमाल किया है। एक तो हेजेमोनिक स्टेबिलिटी थ्योरी, जो कहती है कि जब कोई एक महाशक्ति हावी होती है तो स्थिरता रहती है, उसके हटने से अस्थिरता आती है। और दूसरी है न्यू इंस्टीट्यूशनल इकोनॉमिक्स। ये कहती है कि किसी भी देश में सिर्फ लिखे हुए कानून ही नहीं, बल्कि अलिखित नियम जैसे लोगों की मान्यताएं, उनके नेटवर्क्स, ये सब भी आर्थिक गतिविधियों को बहुत प्रभावित करते हैं।
और MNEs ने CDA का इस्तेमाल इसी संस्थागत अनिश्चितता से निपटने के लिए किया।
एग्जैक्टली, इसी अनिश्चितता को मैनेज करने के लिए।
तो अगर कोई नया शोधकर्ता इस चर्चा को सुन रहा है, तो उनके लिए मुख्य सीख क्या है? क्या बातें ध्यान में रखनी चाहिए?
देखिए, कई जरूरी बातें हैं। पहली, कॉन्टेक्स्ट बहुत जरूरी है। मतलब भू राजनीति, देश का आकार क्या है, छोटा है या बड़ा, और उसका इतिहास क्या रहा है, ये सब बहुत मायने रखता है। दूसरी बात, कंपनियों की सिर्फ मार्केट स्ट्रैटेजी नहीं, बल्कि नॉन मार्केट स्ट्रैटेजीज जैसे CDA, ये संकट के समय में बहुत अहम हो जाती हैं।
और तीसरी
ये कि ये जो अनौपचारिक संस्थान है, मान्यताएं, नेटवर्क, आपसी भरोसे के रिश्ते, ये कॉर्पोरेट स्ट्रैटेजी को बहुत गहराई से प्रभावित करते हैं, खासकर तब जब दुनिया तेजी से बदल रही हो। नए शोधकर्ताओं को ये समझना होगा कि कंपनियों के फैसले सिर्फ प्रॉफिट लॉस देखकर नहीं होते, ये राजनीतिक और सामाजिक फैक्टर भी उनमें बड़ा रोल निभाते हैं।
सही बात है। यानी कंपनियां सिर्फ हालात का शिकार नहीं होती, वो खुद भी हालात को मोड़ने की कोशिश करती हैं।
बिल्कुल, सार यही है कि MNEs सिर्फ देखती नहीं रहती, वो CDA के जरिए भू राजनीति पर असर डाल सकती हैं। लेकिन वो कौन सी रणनीति अपनाएंगी, खोजपूर्ण या रक्षात्मक, और उसका नतीजा क्या होगा, ये बहुत कुछ उनके देश के अंदरूनी अनौपचारिक माहौल पर निर्भर करता है।
तो आज के बदलते हुए ग्लोबल माहौल में, जहां फिर से शक्ति संतुलन बदल रहा है, इन चीजों को समझना, पावर इम्बैलेंस, नॉन मार्केट स्ट्रैटेजीज, संस्थागत संदर्भ, रिसर्च के लिए वाकई बहुत जरूरी हो गया है।
हाँ, और एक सवाल सोचने के लिए छोड़ जाते हैं।
आज जो हम जियोपॉलिटिकल बदलाव देख रहे हैं, क्या दूसरे छोटे देशों की MNEs भी शायद थोड़े अलग या छिपे हुए तरीकों से ऐसी ही CDA रणनीतियों का इस्तेमाल कर रही होंगी गठबंधनों को, प्रतिद्वंदिताओं को साधने के लिए? और क्या इसका असर वैश्वीकरण या फिर बढ़ते विखंडन की अगली लहर पर पड़ सकता है? सोचने वाली बात है।
बिल्कुल, इस बेहतरीन लेख को जरूर पढ़िएगा, लिंक शो नोट्स में है। आज के लिए धन्यवाद।